Arctic frost is Joe Biden's Watergate. Merrick Garland was a fundamentally corrupt attorney general. Jack Smith was a fundamentally corrupt prosecutor. This was a political enemies list from the beginning. 197 subpoenas for 430 Republican entities and individuals. That is an absolute and egregious abuse of power. The Biden Justice Department signed off on issuing subpoenas for the phone records of at least 9 U.S. senators. 20% of the Republicans in the United States Senate were the target of this fishing expedition. They did so in complete contravention.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm your independent political analyst, no spin, no hype, and no tribal loyalty. Just facts, context, and balanced commentary. Today, we're breaking down an explosive statement from Senator Ted Cruz, who claims that the Biden administration's Department of Justice secretly targeted Republican lawmakers, including himself, by issuing subpoenas for their phone records.
Of the Constitution, of separation of powers, of the speech and debate clause, of free speech, of basic rights of privacy. This is an executive who believes it is justified spying on their opponents in the legislature because they convince themselves the ends justify the means. I want to talk to you about one of those subpoenas. One of those subpoenas went from Jack Smith to AT&T, seeking my cell phone communications. It went to AT&T, and I actually want to commend AT&T for doing the right thing. AT&T is based in Texas. AT&T looked at that subpoena, and they went to their legal counsel. And they said, what should we do with that subpoena? And their legal counsel said, you cannot comply because this is protected by the speech and debate clause of the U.S. Constitution. And so AT&T declined to comply, did not hand over my cell phone records. Now, one might ask, ordinarily, a phone company being asked to hand over the phone records of a sitting senator would notify that senator. Well, there was a reason AT&T did not do so. Accompanying the subpoena was an order, which I have in my hand right here, an order that was signed by Judge James E. Boasberg. Now, who is Boasberg? Boasberg is that radical leftist judge who is out of control, who has been issuing nationwide injunctions, one after the other, trying to stop President Trump from carrying out his mandate from the voters. Judge Boasberg issued an order to AT&T and signed that order, prohibiting AT&T from informing me of this subpoena for at least 1 year. And Judge Boasberg gave the basis for that order, and I'm going to quote from the order Judge Boasberg signed. The court finds reasonable grounds to believe that such disclosure will result in destruction of or tampering with evidence, intimidation of potential witnesses, and serious jeopardy to the investigation. That's an order a judge signed. Now, I can tell you right now, there is precisely zero evidence to conclude that I am likely to destroy or tamper with evidence or to intimidate potential witnesses. Zero evidentiary basis for that. This order is an abuse of power. This order is a weaponized legal system. My assumption, we don't have the subpoenas that were issued for the other senators, but my assumption is Judge Boasberg printed these things out like the placemats at Denny's, one after the other. We don't know that for a fact, but I feel confident that he concluded it's likely that Lindsey Graham would destroy evidence, and Marsha Blackburn would destroy evidence, and Eric Schmidt would destroy evidence, and Chuck Grassley would destroy evidence. If a litigant makes a claim for which there is no factual basis, that litigant is subject to sanctions in federal court. And if a judge signs an order reaching a factual conclusion for which there is zero evidence whatsoever, that judge is abusing his power. I am right now calling on the House of Representatives to impeach Judge Boasberg. Judge Boasberg put his robe down, stood up, and said, "Sign me up to be part of the partisan vendetta against 20% of the Republicans in the Senate." That is a dereliction of duty and a violation of the judicial oath. And I want to thank Chairman Grassley and Chairman Johnson for pursuing this tenaciously like a dog on a bone. We are going to get the answers of every person who signed off on this abuse of power, and mark my words, there will be accountability for these zealots who wanted to corrupt the Department of Justice and corrupt the judiciary in order to try to attack their enemies list. That is unconstitutional, it is immoral, and it is wrong. Senator Kennedy.
Cruz is calling it Joe Biden's Watergate. Let's unpack what he said, why it matters, and what questions this raises about power, privacy, and the rule of law. According to Senator Cruz, an operation he refers to as Arctic Frost was essentially a political enemies list. He alleges that 197 subpoenas were issued targeting 430 Republican individuals and organizations, including 9 sitting U.S. senators, roughly 20% of the entire Republican caucus. Cruz says the subpoenas, authorized under Attorney General Merrick, Garland, and Special Counsel Jack Smith, sought private phone data, including his own. He argues this represents a clear violation of the Speech and Debate Clause, free speech, and privacy protections under the Constitution. He even described one subpoena that allegedly went to AT&T for his cell phone records. According to Cruz, AT&T's legal team refused to comply, citing constitutional immunity for legislative communications. Cruz also revealed a court order signed by Judge James E. Boasberg, which reportedly barred AT&T from notifying him about the subpoena for at least 1 year. The justification, according to Cruz's reading of the order, was to prevent possible destruction of evidence or witness intimidation. Cruz strongly disputes that reasoning, saying there was zero evidence to suggest he or any of his colleagues would tamper with evidence. He accused Judge Boasberg of abusing his judicial power and going along with what he calls a partisan vendetta against Republican senators. Cruz didn't stop there. He publicly called for the impeachment of Judge Boasberg, calling his actions a violation of the judicial oath. Now, stepping back from the rhetoric, these are extremely serious allegations. If true, the idea that the Justice Department subpoenaed lawmakers' private records without notifying them raises real constitutional and ethical questions. The separation of powers is designed to prevent exactly this kind of executive overreach where the executive branch spies on or pressures members of the legislature. But we should also note, at this point, there's no public evidence verifying the full scope of Cruz's claims. Federal subpoenas and secrecy orders are not unusual, especially in investigations involving national security or classified leaks. It's possible the DOJ had a legitimate reason unrelated to politics. That said, the lack of transparency feeds suspicion. If the administration or DOJ doesn't clearly explain what these subpoenas were for, the public may assume the worst. And politically, that perception alone is damaging, especially in an election cycle already defined by distrust in federal institutions. Here's the bottom line. Ted Cruz's comments highlight the deep and growing mistrust between elected officials and the justice system. If his allegations are accurate, we're looking at a serious abuse of power reminiscent of past scandals. If they're not, then this could be another example of political theater amplifying that mistrust. Either way, it underscores how fragile the balance is between accountability and political weaponization. We should all want the same thing: a justice system that enforces a law without fear or favor and without being used as a political tool. I'll be following this story closely as more evidence and responses emerge. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think this was legitimate oversight or an overreach by the DOJ? As always, I'm your independent political analyst, bringing you facts, not factions. See you in the next one.